Hello, and welcome back to a bedtime story. Tonight, let the sounds of the modern world slowly fade into the distance. Relax your shoulders, take a slow breath, and imagine that above you is no longer the familiar sky of airplanes, city lights, or peaceful white streaks of cloud. We are turning time backward, returning to about 70 million years ago, when North America was still an ancient land of rivers, forests, soft mud, and creatures no human eye had ever seen. In the place we now call Big Bend, Texas, morning begins with a thin veil of mist drifting across the water. Tree trunks stand motionless in the damp air. Insects murmur somewhere among the leaves. Beneath the shallow mud, small creatures stir quietly. And then, from the edge of that ancient horizon, a very large shadow begins to glide across the ground. It is not a bird. It is not a bat. And although many people casually call it a flying dinosaur, it belongs to another lineage, stranger and more mysterious, one that has vanished completely from the earth. Its name is Quetzalcoatlus, one of the largest flying creatures that ever existed. Before the story begins, try to imagine this. If you were standing beneath the sky of the Cretaceous period and saw a creature nearly as tall as a small giraffe, with wings as wide as a light aircraft, how do you think it would take off? Tonight, we will step slowly into that world, to see this flying giant not as a monster, but as a living mystery of nature. Imagine opening your eyes in a morning so distant, so far away that every familiar sound of the modern world has not yet come into existence. There is no sound of cars passing along the road, no city lights, no airplanes leaving white trails across the sky, no houses, power lines, clocks, maps, or any trace to suggest that human beings have ever set foot here. Before you, there is only an ancient land waking beneath the first light of day, where a thin veil of vapor drifts low over the river, where soft mud still holds the fresh footprints pressed into it during the night, and where the sky is so vast it feels as though no one has ever looked up and given it a name. This is the land we now call Big Bend, Texas. But in this moment, about 70 million years ago, it is not yet the hot, dry landscape of red rock, desert dust, and empty horizons. The world before you is greener, wetter, more alive. Streams of water bend through the lowlands. Mudflats lie still beneath the morning mist. A little farther away, stretches of ancient forest extend into soft, shadowed zones, where trees crowd together in the damp air, and the light has not yet reached the ground. Morning here does not begin with human voices. It begins with sounds smaller, deeper, and far older. The rustle of insects in the leaves, the gentle tapping of water against the muddy bank, the faint crack of a branch breaking somewhere in the forest. Now and then, from a place too distant to see, comes the low, dull sound of a large creature moving through the vegetation. Nothing is in a hurry. Everything seems to breathe in the slow rhythm of a planet still young in the memory of life, even though Earth itself has already passed through billions of years of change. If you stand still beside the water, you may feel that the ground beneath your feet is not entirely silent. It is soft, damp, and full of traces. There are small footprints from reptiles that pass through during the night. There is the long drag mark of a tail. There are tiny holes in the mud where invertebrates hide as the light begins to rise. at the water's edge. The faintest movements make the mud tremble slightly, as though this entire place is holding within it thousands of tiny lives, each one beginning a new day without knowing that it belongs to an age that will one day disappear. Above, the sky opens wide in a pale shade of blue. It is not empty. Long before human beings ever dreamed of flight, the sky already had its own inhabitants. Not birds in the way we know them today, not bats, and not metal machines pushed upward by engines. These creatures belong to another branch of natural history, a branch that once accomplished something that seemed almost impossible, turning a reptilian body into a body capable of flight. They are pterosaurs, the first flying reptiles in the history of vertebrate animals, creatures that filled the sky even before modern wings became familiar to the world. But on this morning, there is one shadow larger than all the rest. At first, you may not see it clearly, only the water changes. A bright patch on the river suddenly darkens for a moment. A long shadow glides across the mud, across low shrubs, across pools of standing water still reflecting the young sunlight. It passes slowly, so slowly that it does not resemble a dive, nor an attack. It is like a piece of the sky has separated from the light and drifted over the ground. Then the shadow disappears, leaving the river glittering again as though nothing has happened. You look up. High above, a gigantic creature is gliding past. Its wings stretch so wide that, for a moment, the modern mind wants to compare it to a small aircraft. But even that comparison is not quite right. An airplane belongs to noise, metal, and the human hand. This creature belongs to wind, hollow bones, wing membranes, and millions of years of silent evolution. It does not fly like a sparrow beating its wings quickly in a garden, nor does it flutter like a small bat beneath the roof at dusk. It appears vast, strange, and almost unreal, as though the Cretaceous sky has shaped itself into a living form. Tens of millions of years later, its name will be Quetzalcoatlus. But in this moment, no one calls it by that name. There is no scientist bending over a fossilized bone, no museum, no illustration, no wingspan measurement or academic debate. There is only the creature itself and the ancient land beneath it. It does not know that it will become one of the most famous flying animals in the history of paleontology. It does not know that, far in the future, human beings will look at thin bones in stone and wonder how a body so large could ever have left the ground. On this morning, it is simply alive, like every other creature around it. And that is what makes the scene even more wondrous. Quetzalcoatlus does not appear as a myth in the eyes of the creatures that live alongside it. It is part of an ordinary day, a frightening, magnificent part, but ordinary nonetheless. The river still flows, insects still call, small creatures still hide beneath the mud. The forest still holds its darkness, and high above, those enormous wings pass by like a familiar sign of the sky. The way we might see gulls over the sea or hawks over open grassland today. But for us, arriving so much later in Earth's story, the sight is almost impossible not to find overwhelming. Everything about it overturns the habits of human imagination. We are used to thinking of large creatures as belonging to the ground: elephants, rhinoceroses, plant-eating dinosaurs. heavy bodies leaving deep footprints behind. We are used to thinking of the sky as the realm of light, quick, small bodies, creatures that can vanish among the clouds with only a few beats of their wings. But Quetzalcoatlus stands between those two ideas. It carries the size of something enormous, yet it belongs to the air. It forces the ground to look upward and gives the sky a sense of weight. If your eyes follow it farther now, you will see the whole world beneath it, opening like an ancient tapestry. The waters do not lie still in one place. They branch, shift direction, carry mud, sand, and layers of sediment that will one day become places where fossilized bones are preserved. Along the riverbank are low grasses, damp roots, and open patches of ground where the sun has begun to dry the upper layer of mud. Farther away, the forest grows denser, hiding large bodies moving slowly through the shade of leaves. There are enormous plant eaters, there are predators, and there are countless smaller creatures living among roots, burrows, soil, and water. Quetzalcoatlus flies above all of this, not like a god separate from the world, but like a creature that understands the invisible map of the place where it lives. It knows the open spaces. It knows the shallow waters. It knows the currents of air that can carry its body across distance. It knows where the ground is soft, where the forest is too dense, where the riverbank is wide enough to land. This knowledge is not taught in words. It lives in the body, in instinct. In millions of years of natural selection that preserved creatures capable of reading wind, water, distance, and light. Perhaps you see it descend a little lower, its wings tilting ever so slightly. Its large body turns in a smooth curve across the sky. Below, the water reflects a fleeting shape before the image breaks apart into small ripples. The scene is not loud. There is no rushing music, no chase to make the viewer's heart race. It is compelling in another way, through the calmness of a world that does not need to perform in order to be magnificent. With only one gigantic creature gliding silently through the morning. We understand that Earth once had chapters so vast that even human imagination must move slowly to keep pace. On the ground below, a new day continues to unfold. Light gradually reaches the mudflats. Mist lifts from the water. The sounds become clearer, fuller, weaving together into a living background. A small creature darts across the edge of the brush and disappears. Another pauses to drink, its head rising very quickly as the shadow above passes by. In this world, every creature is at once alive, listening, and alert. The late Cretaceous is not a peaceful paradise. It is a complex web of hunger, fear, adaptation, and survival. But what matters is that Quetzalcoatlus does not need to be described as a monster in order to be unforgettable. It does not need to roar. It does not need to tear open the night. It does not need to dive down with claws like the images in exaggerated stories. Its greatness lies elsewhere, in the fact that a body could become light enough to fly, yet large enough to change the very feeling of the sky, in the fact that nature found a design unlike anything living around us today, in the fact that the sky was once shared by forms that now survive only in stone, in museums, and in the dreams of science. You can imagine yourself walking slowly along the water's edge, careful not to disturb that morning. Each step sinks lightly into the mud. The smell of damp earth rises. The air grows warmer as the sun climbs higher, and against the sky, the giant creature continues to pass by, at times clear in the light, at times only a dark line between thin clouds. There is something deeply quiet in the way it exists, a silence not born of weakness, but of belonging to a world that had been running for so long before anyone was there to witness it. From our point of view, Quetzalcoatlus is like a doorway into the past, but for the creature itself, that past is the present. It does not live in prehistory. It does not live in a scene reconstructed to satisfy human curiosity. It lives in its own morning, in its own land, beneath its own sky. The idea of prehistory only appears when human beings arrive later and look backward. Back then, the world is complete, whole, unfolding second by second, with all the strange ordinariness of its own existence. Perhaps that is why the story of Quetzalcoatlus has such a powerful pull. It does not only make us ask, how large was this creature? It makes us ask something deeper. How strange could Earth once have become? How many living forms once crossed the sky and left behind nothing but a few fragments of bone? How many mornings once began with the shadow of enormous wings, only to vanish from the memory of the planet before humanity ever appeared? If you listen closely, that question does not make the story frightening. It makes the story wider. Human beings often see the sky as something familiar, a place where clouds drift, birds fly, the sun rises and sets. But the sky has its own history, too. It once belonged to other creatures. There were ages when, as the first light touched the water, a shadow larger than any modern bird could pass over a valley, and, beneath it, an entire ecosystem continued living as though that extraordinary thing were the most ordinary fact in the world. The morning in ancient Big Bend gradually shifts into a brighter rhythm. The last veils of mist dissolve. The green of the forest deepens. The river reflects a wide, still sky. Quetzalcoatlus is farther away now, only a slender shape against the light. Its wings spread like an ancient line drawn across the air before time has had the chance to erase it. It does not know that one day the sky of the pterosaurs will close. It does not know that the rivers, mudflats, and sediment layers beneath it will become the only memories left behind. And it certainly does not know that tens of millions of years later, we will sit in the quiet of night and tell its story as though retelling a real dream of the earth. But for now, all of that still lies far ahead. Its age is still unfolding. The sky is still wide enough for enormous wings. The ground is still rich enough with life to sustain long days. The wind still rises from the water, passes through the forest, slips along open stretches of land, and continues toward the horizon, and in that current of wind. Quetzalcoatlus slowly disappears, leaving behind a feeling difficult to name, a feeling at once small, peaceful, and astonished before a world that once existed without ever needing us to know it. That is where tonight's story truly begins, not with a roar, not with a battle, and not with a discovery in a laboratory. It begins with the sky, a sky before human beings, before written history, before every map and every name, a sky where enormous shadows once moved through the silence, and in the midst of that sky, Quetzalcoatlus appears as a gentle yet profound reminder that Earth once dreamed very large dreams. Long before we arrive to call them miraculous. From a distance, Quetzalcoatlus might make us think of a gigantic bird, but when it stands on the ground, that impression quickly fades. It does not have the shape of an eagle, nor the graceful softness of a swan or a large crane. Its body is tall, long, and jointed in very strange proportions. Its neck rises like a living crane. Its long, narrow head reaches forward like an enormous beak. Its wings, when not opened in the air, are folded along its sides, making this creature look as though it is carrying two structures too large, too thin, too unusual for a body walking on land. The first important thing to remember is that Quetzalcoatlus was not a flying dinosaur. That name is familiar and easy to picture, but it is not accurate. It was a pterosaur, part of a group of flying reptiles that lived alongside dinosaurs, but did not belong to the same branch as the non-avian dinosaurs. If dinosaurs were a great family of the land, with countless forms ranging from two-legged predators to enormous plant eaters, then pterosaurs were another family that found their own path into the sky. They did not evolve into birds, nor were they the direct ancestors of birds. They were nature's own separate experiment. Another answer to the same ancient longing: how could a body with a backbone learn to fly? And among those answers, Quetzalcoatlus was one of the boldest. Imagine a creature that, when standing, could be nearly as tall as a small giraffe, yet was not heavy in the way we usually associate with large bodies. It was not a massive block of flesh dragging itself across the ground. It was a structure built to balance two seemingly opposite demands, strong enough to live, move, hunt, and lift itself into the air, yet light enough for its wings to do their work. And so, when we look at Quetzalcoatlus, we do not simply see size. We see a kind of biological architecture, shaped and refined by nature over millions of years. Its skeleton is where that story begins. Many pterosaur bones in general had a hollow, thin-walled structure, helping to reduce weight while still maintaining the necessary stiffness. If you were to hold such a bone fragment in your hand, you might be surprised that it does not feel as heavy as the size of the animal would suggest. It is like an object designed to bear force through shape rather than mass. This is also one reason pterosaur fossils are often very difficult to preserve. A body light enough to fly also leaves more fragile traces in stone, and that very fragility makes every bone fragment that is found all the more precious. But if we speak only of hollow bones, we still have not fully felt the strangeness of Quetzalcoatlus. Look at its wings. In birds, wings are forelimbs covered with feathers, with those feathers forming the surface that lifts the body through the air. In bats, the wing is a membrane stretched between elongated fingers. But in pterosaurs, especially large ones like Quetzalcoatlus, the wing was supported mainly by an extraordinarily elongated fourth finger, pulling the wing membrane outward from the forelimb toward the body. This made its wings unlike the wings of birds, and not entirely like the wings of bats either. It was like a living sail, stretched across a lightweight skeletal frame, adjusted to the wind through movements that today we can only reconstruct from fossil traces and biomechanics. When those wings were folded, Quetzalcoatlus looked even stranger. We often think flying creatures must appear graceful, even when standing still. But pterosaurs on land did not necessarily carry that familiar elegance. Studies of footprints and anatomy suggest that many pterosaurs moved on all fours when they were on the ground. That means Quetzalcoatlus, in the moment it stood beside the water, may have supported itself with both its hind limbs and forelimbs, its wings folded but still part of the act of walking. This image is very different from birds, because birds walk on two legs and keep their wings as separate structures along the sides of the body. With Quetzalcoatlus, the boundary between wing and forelimb becomes far more unfamiliar, as though its body was made for a life of constant transition between the ground and the sky. Imagine that creature moving slowly across a mudflat, not running, not rushing, but advancing step by deliberate step. Its feet press down and leave soft marks in the damp ground. Its forelimbs brace against the surface, the folded wing still serving as a support. Its long neck leans slightly forward. Its narrow head sweeps through the air like an instrument of observation. None of its movements resemble the modern animals around us. And precisely because of that, it unsettles the human imagination. We want to pull it toward a familiar image, to call it a bird, a bat, or an ancient dragon. But it refuses to fit neatly into any of those names. The head of Quetzalcoatlus also contributed to its almost surreal appearance. Scientific reconstructions often show a long skull and a toothless beak. Suited to catching and swallowing small prey, there were no sharp rows of teeth like those of many ancient marine reptiles. No jaws that evoke the cinematic feeling of a predatory monster. Instead, there was a long, straight beak, likely functioning more as a precise tool than a showy weapon. That lack of teeth alone makes it different from many popular images of prehistoric creatures. It did not need to look fierce in the familiar way to be intimidating. What makes it unforgettable lies in its unusual proportions: a head too long, a neck too tall, a body not as massive as we might expect, and wings broad enough to change the entire space around it. When standing still, Quetzalcoatlus could seem like a bridge between many worlds. Its neck and head may remind us of large wading birds, but its body and wings take us back to an evolutionary branch that has vanished. Its four-limbed gait suggests a land animal. But one look at the structure of its wings tells us this creature did not belong entirely to the ground. It was not simply a bird enlarged in size, nor was it a lizard with wings attached. It was a body built according to its own logic, and that very logic had once succeeded in a world very different from ours today. There is something beautiful in thinking about the body of Quetzalcoatlus. It was not the product of exaggerated imagination. Even though it looked like a creature stepping out of myth, its name was inspired by Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god of Mesoamerican culture. And that makes it even easier for a layer of mythology to gather around it. But beneath that name are bones, strata, measurements, and fossil fragments that scientists have read with great care. Quetzalcoatlus does not need added magic to become wondrous. The truth of its body is already wondrous enough. Let us pause for a moment at the torso. With a creature that had such a gigantic wingspan, we might imagine that its torso must also have been as massive as that of a large beast. But in pterosaurs, the torso is often not the most visually striking part. Their greatness lies in the way the parts of the body are stretched, lightened, strengthened, and coordinated with one another. A relatively compact torso, a long neck, a large head, and wing bones developed to an extreme degree all create a shape that, if sketched roughly, may appear unbalanced. But in nature, imbalance to the human eye does not mean inefficiency. Sometimes, that very imbalance is the sign of deep specialization. That is what makes Quetzalcoatlus so difficult to grasp. If we look only through familiar standards of beauty, it may seem odd, but if we look at it as a creature that truly lived, truly existed, truly fed, and truly grew within its environment, we begin to see the logic hidden beneath the strangeness. Its long neck helped it reach toward the water, the ground, and small prey without lowering its whole body too far. Its long beak helped it catch, pick up, or gather food. Its legs and forelimbs allowed it to move across muddy banks, where even a giant flying animal still needed to stand. Step and turn. Its wings, though cumbersome looking when folded, were the key that opened an entire layer of space above the ground. In the morning light, what color would its skin and wing membranes have been? Here, we must tread carefully. No one can see the true colors of Quetzalcoatlus with the naked eye. Fossils do not give us a complete picture of its skin color, patterns, or the tones across its wing membranes. Therefore, every imagining of its coloration should be understood as a grounded reconstruction, not a certain claim. Perhaps it carried earthy colors, gray, brown, or pale shades that helped it blend into its environment. Perhaps some areas of the body had more striking tones for recognition or communication, as many animals today do. But in our story, the important thing is not to paint it in brilliant colors, but to preserve the feeling that this was a real creature, with details still hidden in the silence of time. Perhaps, when standing beside the water, Quetzalcoatlus did not create an aggressive impression. It may have stood motionless for a very long time, its neck slightly raised, its head turning gently, its eyes watching the small movements before it. Its height would have forced smaller creatures to keep their distance. But it did not need to turn every moment into a threat. Many large animals in nature today are the same. A giraffe crossing the grassland does not need to appear fierce to command our respect. A heron standing at the edge of a lake does not need to make a sound to become the center of the scene. Quetzalcoatlus, in our evidence-based imagination, may have carried that same quiet power, but that power came from more fragility than we might think. A large yet light body is a delicate agreement with physics. Bones must be hollow enough to reduce weight, but not so weak that they break under the body's forces. Wings must be broad enough to create lift, but still controllable in the wind. The neck must be long, yet stable enough to carry the large head. These body parts could not exist separately. They had to work as a system, if we imagine it carelessly. We may turn Quetzalcoatlus into a clumsy monster, but if we respect its real structure, we see a creature that was not random at all, but the result of many limits being solved at once. That is also why Quetzalcoatlus once puzzled both scientists and the public. It was too large for ordinary ideas of flight, The largest flying creatures alive today already surprise us, but Quetzalcoatlus goes beyond the familiar frame. It forces human beings to reconsider the limits of the living body. Not everything large must be heavy in the way we imagine. Not everything that flies must be small, and not every vanished design was a failed design. Pterosaurs existed for a very long time, and giants like Quetzalcoatlus were among the final. Bold, almost impossible-looking chapters of that story. Look at it again, slowly, a creature standing in the damp lands of the late Cretaceous. Beneath its feet are soft mud and shallow water. Behind it is an ancient forest. Above it, the wide sky. Its long neck lifts its head above the low vegetation. Its folded wings hang at its sides like two curtains not yet opened. The skeleton inside is lighter than the eye would guess. Every part of that body speaks of a way of life we no longer see on Earth today. The life of a giant flying reptile. Familiar because it was still a creature of bone, muscle, and survival needs. Yet alien because its form belonged to an evolutionary branch that has closed forever. And it is at this point that the story of Quetzalcoatlus comes close to myth. Even though it is not myth, many cultures once imagined dragons, flying serpents, giant birds, creatures that could darken the sun with their wings. But here, Earth did not need legend to create such a thing. In a real age, beneath a real sky. There once lived a body shaped almost like something from humanity's oldest dreams. The only difference is that when Quetzalcoatlus was still flying, human beings did not yet exist to fear it, worship it, or tell stories about it beside a fire. It simply lived within its own world, and that world has vanished. Not in a single moment that we will tell right now, because the story still has many layers to pass through. But simply looking at the body of Quetzalcoatlus is enough to feel the enormous distance between today and that age. No creature in the modern sky stands like it. No wings open according to that same structure. No shadow belonging to a giant flying reptile glides over rivers in the morning. What remains are fossils, studies, models, illustrations, and the careful imagination of human beings. Perhaps that is why, when we think of Quetzalcoatlus, what is astonishing is not only its size. What is astonishing is that such a body once functioned as something ordinary in nature. It once grew, once stood beneath the sunlight, once folded its wings beside the water, once looked down upon a world filled with the smell of mud, damp air, and tiny movements, every part of it, from hollow bones to long beak, from tall neck to wing membrane, is evidence that life can travel very far beyond the familiar shapes we know. And as we sit quietly tonight, imagining that creature again, perhaps we do not need to turn it into a monster, nor make it more violent than the truth. It is enough to let it stand there, beside the ancient water, in the rising light, a body unlike anything still alive today, a form both alien and real, a reminder that the history of life is not only a sequence of species that arrived and disappeared, but also a treasury of wondrous designs, possibilities once tested, and beauties that vanished before human beings ever had the chance to name them. In the thin mist still lingering above the water, Quetzalcoatlus slowly raises its head. Its wings remain folded along its sides. That tall body stands motionless, like a question written in bone, skin, wind, and time. And the longer we look, the more we understand that before we learn how it flew, before we enter the moment when those gigantic wings opened into the sky, we must first learn to see it as a real creature, not a bird, not a bat, not a dinosaur, but something entirely different, a lost branch of life, standing there long before us, in a morning when Earth still kept for itself secrets too great and too gentle to be easily understood. Of all the questions Quetzalcoatlus has left behind for human beings, perhaps none awakens the imagination more powerfully than this one. How did a creature so large ever leave the ground? Let us return to that ancient land on a windless morning. The shallow water lies still between two muddy banks. The sun is still low, slanting through the tree trunks and making the vapor above the ground glow like a thin layer of smoke. Quetzalcoatlus is standing at the edge of an open clearing. Its enormous wings remain folded along both sides of its body. Its long neck dips slightly, then rises again, as though it is reading the smallest movements in the air beneath its feet. The ground is soft but firm enough. Ahead lies an open stretch leading toward the riverbank. Above is the sky, wide, clear, and waiting. If we look at it through the experience of the modern world, it is easy to find this almost absurd. A creature with a wingspan wide enough to remind us of a small aircraft still has to begin from the ground, from mud, from gravity. A large bird today often needs to run, beat its wings, and fight against the weight of its body through many continuous movements. A gull can launch itself from a cliff. An eagle can take advantage of mountain winds. A swan must skim across the water for a long distance before it truly lifts into the air. But Quetzalcoatlus is not like them. Its wings are too wide, its body structure too different, and if we imagine it running across the ground like a gigantic seabird, we immediately see a problem. Those wings could become cumbersome before they had the chance to open completely. For that reason, the takeoff of Quetzalcoatlus should not be imagined as a familiar scene from life today. It was not a giant bird gathering speed across a sandy shore, nor was it an ancient aircraft needing a long runway to accelerate. It was a creature belonging to another evolutionary branch, and its body may have found another way into the sky. Many researchers believe it may have launched itself powerfully upward from the ground first, lifting its body to an initial height, and only then opening its broad wings and beginning to flap in order to generate lift. In other words, instead of running a long distance so that the sky could pull it upward, it may have pushed itself away from the ground in a single powerful leap. Imagine that moment slowly. Quetzalcoatlus stands motionless for a few seconds, not because it is hesitating, but because its body is preparing. The joints bear the load, the muscles contract, weight gathers downward, like a great bow being drawn tight. The neck lowers slightly to maintain balance. The wings are not yet fully opened, but the shoulders and forelimbs are already part of that preparatory posture, in the moment before movement happens. This creature may seem heavier than ever, as though the ground is holding it with all the force of its pull. Then the leap comes, not a light jump, not the graceful motion of a small bird leaving a branch. It is a strong, rapid, energy-filled movement, a moment when the entire body seems to compress and then spring upward. The ground beneath its feet may tremble slightly. the soft mud may hold a deep impression of force. That large body leaves the ground not through magic, but through a structure that evolved to do exactly this. For one very brief moment. Quetzalcoatlus is not quite flying yet. It is between two worlds. No longer standing on the earth, but not yet fully belonging to the air. That in-between moment is where the real wonder lies. Because once the body has been pushed high enough, the wings have room to open. The wing membranes stretch wide, catching the air. The first beats may be heavier and slower than those of a small bird, but each one carries tremendous power. The air is no longer an invisible emptiness. It becomes a living material, a current the wings can grip, push downward, bend through, and turn into lift from below. If anyone had been there to witness it, they would have seen a creature that seemed to belong to the ground, suddenly received by the wind. We should pause here for a moment, because this is where the story can easily become too certain. None of us has ever seen Quetzalcoatlus take off. There is no footage from the Cretaceous period. There is no trace recording every second of movement. What science has is bone, body proportions, traces from pterosaur relatives, mechanical models, and careful comparisons with modern flying animals. So when we say Quetzalcoatlus may have leapt upward and then flown, we are speaking of a reasonable model based on evidence, not a scene directly observed by human eyes. But that lack of absolute certainty does not make the story less compelling. On the contrary, it makes every detail deeper, because every image must pass through a layer of humility before time. After that first leap, the next problem is staying in the air. A large creature cannot waste energy forever through constant flapping. In the sky, everything is a negotiation between power and economy. Large birds today often use rising air currents, winds along mountain slopes, heat lifting from the ground, or moving pockets of air to glide over great distances without needing to beat their wings too often. Quetzalcoatlus, with its broad wings and a body light for its size, most likely knew how to use the sky in a similar way. Once it had risen high enough, it could shift from the stage of powerful flapping into the stage of gliding, allowing the wind to do the rest of the work. Look at it once it has passed the most difficult moment. Its wings are spread wide, tilted gently. Its body begins to stabilize. The wing beats grow farther apart. Below, the mudflats and the water begin to shrink. The tree trunks become dark green patches. The waterways winding through the ancient land look like bright ribbons of silk. Quetzalcoatlus does not need to fly fast in order to impress. Simply being high above is enough to change the way we feel the sky. Its greatness does not lie in speed, but in presence. It is like a doorway opening into a layer of space that very few creatures of that time could use in such a way. From the ground, a small creature might see only the shadow. A bright area suddenly darkens. A light breeze passes over. Then that shadow slides across the water's edge, across tree trunks, across fresh footprints pressed into the mud for the creatures living below. Quetzalcoatlus may not always be a direct threat, but its presence is still a great signal. The sky is not empty. The sky has an observer. The sky has wings wide enough to travel from one stretch of water to another, from one forest to another, crossing distances that walking creatures would take far, far longer to cover. This helps us understand why the ability to take off matters so much. Flight is not only a beautiful act, It is a strategy for life. A creature that can leave the ground sees the world through a different map. It can find food in more places. It can avoid certain dangers. It can move across difficult terrain. It can follow rivers, lake shores, open patches of land, and choose where to descend. But all those advantages begin with one very specific moment. The moment when the body must overcome gravity for the first time. Perhaps, on an ordinary day, Quetzalcoatlus would not take off in haste unless it needed to, for a large body. Every launch into the air is an investment of energy. It would not throw itself into the sky simply to make the world more beautiful in our eyes. It flew for a reason, to move to another feeding area, to leave a place that was no longer favorable, to avoid a threat, or to take advantage of good wind. This practical truth makes the image of it even more alive. It was not a symbol forever spreading its wings in the sunset. It was a creature that had to calculate through instinct, use its strength at the right moment, and understand the limits of its own body. Imagine an afternoon when the ground has begun to warm after many hours of sunlight. The air over open flats starts to move gently, rising into invisible currents. Quetzalcoatlus stands at the edge of the forest, watching the open space before it. The wind is not too strong. There is enough room beneath its feet. The ground is drier than it was in the morning, less slippery, more favorable for a leap. That tall body adjusts its posture. A small movement passes through the shoulders, the back, the forelimbs, and the hind limbs. Then, as though the entire creature has become a mechanism released from its lock, it gathers its force, springs upward, opens its wings, and steps into the air. This time, when the wings catch the wind, it does not need to flap too much. A few strong beats carry it higher. Then it tilts its wings and glides along a current of air rising from the warm ground. Each circling glide lifts it a little more, from a distance. That motion may look slow and peaceful, but within it is constant precision. If the angle of the wings is wrong, if speed drops too much, or if the wind shifts unexpectedly, that large body must adjust at once. Flying is not escaping physics. Flying is living with physics so skillfully that the observer mistakes it for freedom. There is a quiet beauty in this thought. Quetzalcoatlus does not defeat gravity once and then escape it forever, every second in the sky. It is still working with gravity. It falls a little, rises a little, tilts, balances, changes direction, saves energy, searches for a new current of air. The sky is not a place without rules. The sky is where rules become more refined. And that gigantic creature, with its hollow bones, membranous wings, powerful flight muscles, and instincts polished over countless generations, learned how to move through those rules. When we look up from below, it is easy to forget the labor hidden inside flight. A creature gliding high above always seems lighter than it truly is. But before that comes the entire story of the body. Bones must withstand the force of launch. Joints must not fail under pressure. Muscles must be strong enough to create the first wing beats. Wings must open at the right moment, and the brain must process movement in three-dimensional space from the instant it leaves the ground. A single second of error could turn takeoff into danger. With Quetzalcoatlus, Size makes everything more magnificent, but it also makes every mistake more costly. And so, when we imagine it rising into the air, we should not see only wonder. We should also see discipline. There is no room for carelessness in such a body. Every part of it must coordinate with the others in an order no human designed, but nature selected across an immense span of time. And perhaps that is exactly what makes Quetzalcoatlus more fascinating than any exaggerated image. It does not need to be turned into a dragon. It was already a real answer to an almost impossible problem. How could a tall, long-necked, wide-winged creature, living on the ground and beside the water, still enter the sky? High above, it continues to glide. The river below opens into bright lines. The mudflats become pale brown patches. Clusters of trees gather like soft shadows upon the land. From that height, the world is no longer separate shrubs or small streaks of water. It becomes a continuous map of opportunity and risk. Where there is shallow water, where there is open ground, where the wind is blocked by forest, where it may land safely, everything below has meaning. But that meaning fully appears only to a creature able to see from above. And then, at some point, Quetzalcoatlus cannot fly forever. Every flight needs an ending. Landing is also part of the story. Though it is rarely spoken of with the same suspense as takeoff, a large body returning to the ground must slow down, adjust the angle of its wings, and choose a place wide and safe enough. It must turn the movement of the air back into a standing posture on land, from spread wings to folded forelimbs, from lift back into weight. Perhaps it descends near the water's edge, where the open space is wide enough. The wings tilt, the body lowers, the feet touch down first, or almost at the same time with support from the forelimbs. The mud sinks slightly, the wings fold, and the creature that belonged to the sky returns to the earth. That moment helps us understand that Quetzalcoatlus lived on a boundary. It was not entirely like the small creatures of the air, born to fly constantly among branches and clouds. Nor was it entirely like the heavy creatures of the ground, forever bound to the path of their feet. It stood between two worlds, and every takeoff was a crossing of that boundary. On the ground, it was a tall, unfamiliar figure moving through mud with slow steps. In the sky, it was a living plane, a broad shadow, a shape that turned wind into a road. Perhaps that is why the question, how did it take off, is not only a technical question. Behind it is something almost poetic. How far did life once try to push its own limits? How many ways are there for a body to leave the ground? How many times in the history of Earth did nature find solutions that no living creature retains today? When we look at Quetzalcoatlus, we are not only looking at an extinct species, we are looking at a vanished possibility. In the afternoon light of the Cretaceous, the wind begins to change direction. Thin clouds drift across the sky. Quetzalcoatlus stands again beside a stretch of shallow water, its wings folded, its long neck reflected faintly on the surface. Just a short while before, that body had been high above, light as a dark line drawn against the sky. Now it belongs to the ground again, casting its shadow onto the mud, silent among the insects and the sound of running water. That transformation, from heavy to light, from standing to flying, from mud into wind, and back to mud again, was one of the most wondrous things its body ever did. And though we cannot see it with our own eyes, though every image must remain within the limits of evidence and caution, we can still feel the beauty of that moment. A gigantic creature lowers itself. The ground holds it for a breath. The body gathers its force. Then, in one powerful and precise movement, it leaps, opens its wings, and lets the ancient sky take hold of it. Not like magic, not like legend, but like a strange truth that once happened on Earth, long before anyone stood below to look up in wonder. Tonight, as we imagine that scene, what we hear is not a roar, but the wind, a current of air passing across the wing membrane, a heavy wing beat beginning the flight, a large shadow sliding over the river, and above that ancient land. Quetzalcoatlus vanishes once more into the sky, carrying with it its own answer to the question human beings will continue to ask. How could something so great ever have flown? Beneath the wide sky of the late Cretaceous, where shallow waters curved through damp mudflats and low bands of green vegetation, Quetzalcoatlus was not always a shadow in flight. There were long hours of the day when it belonged to the ground. It stood there, tall and silent, its wings folded along its sides, its long neck rising above the thin veil of vapor, its eyes watching the mud as though reading a language human beings no longer know. If we imagine it only in the sky, we miss an important half of this creature's life. Because to survive, it did not only need to fly, it also needed to eat, to choose where to feed, to step through shallow waters, to understand the rhythm of small creatures hidden beneath the soft ground. Imagine that the morning has passed, the sun has risen higher, slowly dissolving the thin mist over the river. Streaks of light fall onto the water, breaking into glittering fragments among algae, mud, and small ripples. The wind is not strong. It is just enough to stir the edges of leaves, enough to make the water tremble gently, enough to carry the smell of damp earth and plants warming beneath the day. Quetzalcoatlus stands at the edge of a shallow stretch of water, where the riverbank does not drop sharply but spreads outward into soft mudflats. This is not a random place for a creature like it. Shallow waters could be a vast table of food, where small fish, invertebrates, amphibians, and small reptiles moved back and forth in silence. It steps into the water not with the haste of a predator rushing into the hunt. Each step is slow, almost deliberate. Its foot touches the mud, and the water spreads outward in small circles before quickly settling again. Its forelimb braces against the ground, its wings still folded, its tall body leaning slightly with the movement. From a distance, the scene might make us think of a gigantic heron. But that comparison is only partly true. Quetzalcoatlus was not a bird, and its posture carries something far more unfamiliar. It is like a living crane moving through wet ground, at once slender, powerful, and fragile in the way only bodies made for flight can be. In popular stories about prehistoric creatures, human imagination is often drawn toward violent hunting scenes. We are used to picturing roars, claws, sharp teeth, and chases through brush and swamp. But the real life of nature is often quieter than that. Much of life does not unfold as one great battle, but as countless small moments of watching, waiting, reacting, and conserving energy. Quetzalcoatlus, if it fed along shallow waters, as many scientific models suggest, may also have lived according to that rhythm. It did not need to turn every meal into a wild spectacle. It only needed to stand in the right place, look at the right moment, and use its long beak with precision. Beneath the murky water, a small world is moving. A tiny fish changes direction among submerged roots. A soft-bodied creature slips deeper into the mud. A young amphibian stirs faintly in the shallow water near the bank. These movements are very small if seen by human eyes from a distance, but to a predator that has lived in this environment, they are not meaningless. The surface of the water trembles slightly. A faint cloud of mud spreads outward. A small shadow passes between two patches of light. Quetzalcoatlus lowers its long head. There is no loud sound, no dramatic plunge, only a quick, clean, almost sudden movement after many seconds of stillness. The beak touches the water, then lifts. If the prey is small enough, it may be swallowed whole. No need to chew, no need to tear. The toothless beak structure of Quetzalcoatlus means we should not imagine it ripping apart large prey like predators with sharp jaws. A more reasonable feeding style would be to catch small creatures, swallow them quickly, and continue watching. It is a kind of hunting that may seem less dramatic to an audience, but in nature, it can be highly effective. A day of life does not require one enormous meal if the shallow water is rich enough in small creatures. Many small meals, many brief opportunities seized, many moments of silent waiting could sustain a body that we often think of only through its wingspan. There is a special beauty in that scene. A creature that once could cast a shadow across the ground now bends down to search for tiny movements in the mud. That contrast makes Quetzalcoatlus feel more real. It is not only a symbol of the sky, but also a resident of the riverbank. It does not only glide over the world from above, it also has to know where small fish gather, where the mud is too deep, where the water is shallow enough to enter, and where it can retreat if the ground becomes dangerous. Its entire life is joined between two spaces, the vastness of the air and the seemingly ordinary edges of water, and those very edges of water may determine whether it lives another day. When Quetzalcoatlus moves along the riverbank, it does not walk like a hunting beast on an open plain. It does not crouch low to the ground in ambush. It is taller than most of the small creatures around it, and that height allows it to observe a wide area. Its long neck lets the head reach forward without forcing the whole body too close to the soft mud. This is important, for a large body made light enough to fly. Becoming trapped in deep mud would be no small risk. And so, every step into the water may be a balance between opportunity and danger. Where there is abundant food, the ground is often less stable. A hunter of shallow waters must learn to read not only its prey, but also the very ground beneath its feet. At times, it stops for a very long while. To a modern observer, that stillness might make time itself seem to slow down. But in nature, standing still does not mean doing nothing. The eyes continue to watch. The neck still adjusts its height ever so slightly. the body still holds its balance. The beak points downward like a long arrow waiting for the right moment. Many successful predators do not rely on constant bursts of power, but on the ability not to waste movement. Quetzalcoatlus may have been such a creature, enormous in the sky, but patient beside the water, using silence as part of its strategy for survival. Nearby, the river continues to flow. It is not a modern river with a name, a map, or reinforced banks. It is an ancient current, changing with the seasons, carrying mud, sand, branches, dead leaves, and small lives. After rains, the water may rise and flood the low flats. When conditions become drier, it withdraws, leaving behind isolated pools where small fish and invertebrates may become trapped. Places like these would be ideal feeding grounds for many animals. Quetzalcoatlus, with the ability to travel far on its wings, could seek out favorable waters, inspect each stretch of bank, and leave when that place was no longer worth staying in. We can imagine that its feeding day did not unfold at a single spot. In the morning, it stands beside one shallow branch of water. At midday, when sunlight warms the ground and the air begins to move, it may fly to another stretch of river. In the afternoon, it lands near a broader muddy area, where the water is withdrawing and exposing many small traces. Each place offers a different opportunity. Each landing is a choice. Each takeoff is an energy cost. And so, its life is not an aimless wandering, but a continuous connection between instinctive memory, landscape, and the need to survive. This makes the image of Quetzalcoatlus very different from the simple idea of the giant that ruled the sky, high above. It may make us think of power, but beside the shallow water. It is also dependent on small things: water level, the softness of mud, the timing of prey movement, the direction of the wind when it needs to leave, the presence of other species in the area. No creature truly stands outside its ecosystem, however large it is. It still has to eat, however high it flies. It still has to land, however wide its wings are. It remains tied to the ground by the most basic needs of life. Sometimes, perhaps, it encounters other creatures along the water's edge. A small herbivore comes to drink, then quickly retreats when it notices that tall figure. A small reptile lies still in the warm mud, trying to blend into its surroundings. Smaller pterosaurs may appear in another part of the lake or riverbank, searching for food in their own way. But we do not need to turn those encounters into conflict. In nature, many creatures share the same landscape through distance, different habits, and different times of activity. Quetzalcoatlus may stand within its own area, feeding quietly, while the world around it continues to operate through hundreds of parallel rhythms of life. As the light grows stronger, the water becomes clearer in a few places. The long beak lowers again. This time, the movement is almost too quick compared with the stillness that came before. A small splash rises, then falls back into droplets on the mud. The giant creature lifts its head. Its neck moves in a slow curve, carrying the prey into its mouth. A moment later, everything is still again. If we were standing far enough away, perhaps we would hear nothing but insects, running water, and the faint breath of wind passing over the folded wing membrane along its side. That quietness suits a bedtime story. Not because it makes Quetzalcoatlus gentler than the truth, but because it brings us closer to the real rhythm of an ancient creature's life. It is not a nightmare. It is not a monster waiting in the dark. It is a living body doing what every living body must do, finding energy in order to continue existing. And in that ordinary act, it becomes strangely familiar, though it is separated from us by tens of millions of years, though its form resembles no creature still alive. It still shares with all living beings a simple rule: life must be nourished day by day. Perhaps when the afternoon shadows begin to lean, Quetzalcoatlus leaves the edge of the shallow water and steps onto drier ground. Mud clings lightly to its feet, its neck rises, its head turning toward a more open stretch in the distance. Perhaps it has eaten enough. Perhaps it will move to another place before nightfall. That tall body stands on the boundary between two worlds. Behind it is the water that has fed it. Before it is the open ground that may lead to another flight. But even as it prepares to leave, the water's edge still holds its traces, footprints larger than those of many creatures nearby, disturbed patches of mud, small rings of water fading away. An ordinary scene, yet to us, it feels like the trace of a very ancient dream. If we look a little more broadly, we see that shallow waters are not only places to feed, they are quiet stages where the body of Quetzalcoatlus reveals another part of itself, in the sky. It is a symbol of vastness. Beside the water, it is a symbol of patience. Above, it reads the wind. Below, it reads the mud. In flight, it uses its wings to cross distance. In hunting, it uses height, a long neck, and a narrow beak to reach tiny movements. The same body appears differently in each environment, as though nature has written into it many answers for many circumstances. For that reason, calling it a predator should not make us think only of violence. In the natural world, predation is part of the order of life. A heron catching fish in a lake does not make the lake cruel. A kingfisher diving into the water does not turn mourning into tragedy. And Quetzalcoatlus, when it lowers its long beak into the shallow water, belongs to that same order. It takes from the environment what its body needs, then leaves behind ripples, footprints, and silence. The beauty of this scene does not lie in blood or violence, but in the ancient precision of life. By the time sunset touches the river, the color of the water begins to turn a dark gold. Tree trunks cast longer shadows. The air softens, and the sound of insects grows more even, like a very distant layer of music. Quetzalcoatlus stands motionless for a few final seconds beside the water, its tall figure reflected faintly on the river's surface. Then it turns away, stepping slowly toward drier ground. Its wings remain folded, but within that shape there is already the promise of the sky. Given the right moment, the right open space, the right current of air, this heavy, silent body beside the mud can once again become a shadow, passing high above, and as it leaves the shallow water. We understand one more thing about this strange creature. Quetzalcoatlus is not memorable only because it was large. It is memorable because it lived at delicate intersections between earth and sky, between strength and lightness, between gigantic size and tiny meals, between the mythic image in human imagination and the very real life of a creature that once stood beneath the sun, in the shallow waters of ancient Big Bend. It did not need to do anything more than live according to the body it had. And that alone is enough to make the entire landscape feel wondrous. Tonight, if you close your eyes, you may still see it there, not in a battle, not amid roars and clouds of dust, but in the stillness of an ancient riverbank. A long neck lowering toward the water, a beak touching the soft mud, a small ring of ripples spreading outward, then disappearing. Above, the sky begins to change color. Below, the water continues to flow, carrying traces that time will bury, compress, and perhaps one day turn into clues for human beings to find. And Quetzalcoatlus, the hunter of shallow waters, walks through the evening light, silent as the very world that gave rise to it. Let the landscape widen for a moment beyond the wings of Quetzalcoatlus. Look down at the land beneath it, not as a blurred backdrop behind the giant creature, but as a world with its own breath, its own rhythm, its own rivers, mudflats, forests, footprints, and changing seasons, because no creature exists alone. Quetzalcoatlus could only be Quetzalcoatlus in a place wide enough for it to fly, open enough for it to land, rich enough in shallow waters for it to feed, and alive enough to nourish an entire ancient ecosystem around it. Today, when people speak of Big Bend, many imagine the hot, dry landscape of western Texas, with rocky mountains, deep canyons, layers of red earth, drought-resistant shrubs, and a desert sky so vast it can feel overwhelming. It is a landscape beautiful in a harsh way, where sunlight can sharpen the edges of everything, where stone seems to hold the silence of millions of years. But if we turn back to around 70 million years ago, that land would not appear that way. Ancient Big Bend was not the familiar desert picture. It was wetter, greener, lower, and full of flowing waters quietly writing their history into mud and sand. Imagine standing on a broad floodplain. Beneath your feet is soft ground, with some patches still damp after the water has just receded. Before you, a branch of river bends through the lowland, not straight, not forced between embankments, but freely changing direction with the seasons, with rainfall, with the sinking of mud, with the layers of sand carried in and left behind. There are stretches where the water flows so slowly that the river surface resembles a cloudy mirror. There are shallow sections that spread outward into marshy ground, where plants grow close to the water's edge and roots grip the damp mud. Farther away, deep green forests stretch into dark bands, hiding countless movements inside them, movements we can hear but cannot yet see. This world is not quiet in the sense of emptiness. It is quiet in the way a place can be too vast, too ancient, too full of tiny life for any single sound to stand apart, so that everything blends into one steady background. Insects call from the bushes. Water flows past exposed roots. Mud cracks softly as a small creature crawls through it. Leaves are pulled down by a larger body somewhere in the forest, and somewhere high above, wind passes across the broad wing membranes of a distant gliding pterosaur. If you close your eyes, you can feel that ancient Big Bend is not merely a place, it is a breath, slow and damp, stretched beneath the sunlight of the late Cretaceous. Water is the element that keeps this world alive. Rivers do not only bring drinking water, they carry mud, nutrients, rotting leaves, seeds, tiny shells, aquatic creatures. and even the geological memory of the land. Each season of rising water can spread a new layer of sediment across the floodplain. Each time the water withdraws, it reveals shallow pools, ribbons of mud, and river edges rich with food for small creatures. This is a place of shelter and reproduction for predators. This is where opportunity appears. For Quetzalcoatlus, those shallow waters may have been living pathways, resting points, places it returned to again and again in its journey between sky and ground. But ancient Big Bend was not only water, it had plants. And plants are often the forgotten part when we tell stories about the world of dinosaurs. Tree trunks, low shrubs, mats of leaves, roots, and riverside forests created shelter for small animals, food for herbivores, shade for damp ground, and natural boundaries between open spaces. We do not need to imagine a dense tropical rainforest covering everything. The landscape may have shifted constantly, denser forest along the water, broad floodplains opening outward, drier patches with low vegetation and clear ground, places cut across by water and then abandoned as small lakes. That very variation made this place rich with life. Each patch of landscape was a different opportunity for a different kind of body. In the distance, among layers of vegetation and low brush, there may have been large herbivorous creatures moving. We do not need to present them as monsters in a battle. It is enough to let them exist as slow-moving masses of life, making the plants tremble slightly as they pass. A long neck rises among the leaves. A heavy tail sweeps through the low brush. Footsteps leave deep marks in damp soil. Those large creatures belong to the ground in the same way Quetzalcoatlus belongs to the boundary between earth and sky. They pass through forest corridors, searching for food, searching for water, avoiding mud that is too soft, and leaving behind traces that time may one day bury. Closer to the water's edge, life unfolds on a smaller scale, but no less importantly, small fish move beneath the murky water. Invertebrates hide in the mud. Small reptiles warm themselves where sunlight touches down. Amphibians or water-edge creatures take advantage of the damp zones. On the ground, insects move among rotting wood and fallen leaves. It is a world that becomes denser the closer we look. And for a creature like Quetzalcoatlus, that density of small life may have mattered more than any grand spectacle. An ecosystem is not sustained only by giant bodies, but by countless small pieces of life quietly connecting to one another. On a day like this, Quetzalcoatlus may glide across many different kinds of landscape. From above, it does not see Big Bend as we see a photograph. It may recognize brighter lines of water, open mudflats, forests too dense for landing, clear stretches of ground wide enough, areas that may contain food. The sky gives it vision, but the ground determines the value of that vision. A shallow stretch of water may be more important than a beautiful forest. A floodplain newly exposed after the water has withdrawn may matter more than a high, dry patch of land. To it, the landscape is a map of need, where to feed, where to rest, where to leave from, when to return. Perhaps at midday, when the sunlight grows stronger, the air above the open ground begins to rise in warm currents. From below, we cannot see those streams of air, but to a large flying creature, they may be invisible roads. Quetzalcoatlus glides higher, its wings spread wide, tilting gently with the wind. Beneath it, ancient Big Bend opens into a broad painting, a bright river, brown mud flats, dark green forest, small lakes reflecting the sky, open ground printed with footprints, and trails made by large creatures passing through again and again. From that height, everything is both vast and fragile. A heavy rain can change the river's course. A dry season can cause many shallow pools to disappear. A flood can bury footprints and fallen trees beneath a new layer of mud. It is a world always changing, though in a rhythm very slow compared with a human life. Places that are riverbanks today may become riverbeds after a season of water. Places that are shallow lakes today may be filled with sand and mud. Fallen trees may create shelter for small creatures, then slowly decay, then disappear. Life adapts to that change not through conscious plans, but through habits, instincts, and bodies. A walking species knows to avoid deep mud. A small species knows to hide among roots. A predator knows where prey gathers. A giant pterosaur knows how to use the sky to connect separate living zones into a larger space. If we walk slowly through this land in our imagination, we will see that ancient Big Bend is not an empty stage for Quetzalcoatlus to perform upon. It is a network. Every flow of water draws behind it a chain of life. Every mudflat preserves the traces of bodies that have passed through. Every patch of forest hides both food and danger. Every open stretch of land is a place where light, wind, and movement meet. Quetzalcoatlus is only one part of that network. Even if it is the part that most easily makes us look upward, it does not rule by separating itself from the world, but survives because it understands that world well enough to use it. There are moments when that giant creature may descend onto a broad floodplain, where the ground is firm enough and water lies nearby. When its legs and forelimbs touch down, it becomes once more a resident of the ground, high above. It may seem like a pure form of flight, but here, among mud and plants, it has a shadow, it has weight, it has footprints. It must step over small channels left behind by water. It must avoid patches of ground that are too soft. It must turn its body between low shrubs. It must live in the same physical world as every other creature. And that is what makes it more believable, closer, more real. Far away, a group of smaller herbivores may move through sparse vegetation. They do not necessarily panic at the sight of Quetzalcoatlus, but they recognize its presence in nature. Recognition does not always lead to flight. Sometimes it is only a raised head, a few seconds of stillness. And then movement continues when danger does not come closer. In the shallow waters, smaller creatures may be more cautious. A large shadow overhead can silence the surface for a moment. A long neck bending toward the muddy bank can send tiny movements vanishing into deeper places. Ancient Big Bend is full of reactions like this, tiny signals passing through the landscape without any need for loud sound. We should not imagine this place as a land of constant violence. There is violence in nature, of course. There is predation, death, hunger, and competition, but there are also many long hours of ordinary life. Mornings when the water rises gently, hot, still noons, afternoons when the wind changes direction, nights when insects call in the darkness. An ecosystem is not made only of dramatic moments, but of the repetition of small things: water flowing, plants growing, mud drying, new footprints crossing over old ones. One creature coming to drink, another leaving. A large shadow passing overhead and then disappearing. And perhaps it is precisely that repeated rhythm that makes ancient Big Bend such an ideal place for a bedtime story. It does not need to push us into constant tension. It invites us to slow down, look longer, and feel how a world functioned before there was any human memory. We can stand beside a tree trunk, listen to the water, and imagine layers of sediment quietly forming beneath our feet. We can look up at the sky and see a giant pterosaur gliding past. Then look down at the mud and see countless tiny traces of creatures that will never be named in popular culture. All of them existed together. All of them were carried away by time. All of them left incomplete fragments for the future. One very strange thing is that Big Bend today is much drier. Yet that very dryness helps us see the past. Exposed rock layers, sedimentary cliffs, and bands of differently colored earth resemble pages torn from a book, damaged but still carrying enough words to be read. Even so, in this story, we do not yet need to step into the journey of the fossil hunters. It is enough to know that the land beneath Quetzalcoatlus will not keep this shape forever. Rivers will change course. Mud will dry. Sediment will be buried deep, compressed, lifted, and eroded. Forests will vanish. Waters will withdraw from the memory of the surface. And one day, very far away, this once damp place will become the desert landscape known to modern human beings. That thought makes the scenery before us feel more fragile. We look at the river and know it is not eternal. We look at the mudflat and know it will become stone. We look at the forest and know that not a single leaf will remain intact into our age. We look at Quetzalcoatlus and know those wings will not remain in the sky forever, but in this moment, everything is still alive, not as a relic, not as a fossil, not as a lesson in a book, but as a real afternoon with real light, real water, real heat, and a giant creature standing in the damp land, silently belonging to this place. As the sun lowers, ancient Big Bend changes color. The waters reflect gold. The muddy banks darken. The forest becomes deep patches of shadow. The air grows softer, but still holds the warmth of the long day. Quetzalcoatlus stands beside an open stretch, its head turned toward the river. Perhaps it has fed. Perhaps it is waiting for the wind to shift. Perhaps it is simply resting in a state of quiet alertness we cannot fully understand. Around it, the world continues in its own rhythms. A small creature crawling across rotting wood. A fish disturbing the water's surface. A low sound echoing from the forest. Then silence. From a distance, the scene resembles a painting made of soft colors, the gold of evening light, the brown of mud, the dark green of forest, the dull silver of water, and the tall form of Quetzalcoatlus standing at the boundary between them all. It does not need to do anything extraordinary in that moment. The place where it stands is already extraordinary. Big Bend, before it became desert, was not only its backdrop, it was the cradle that allowed this creature to exist. floodplains to walk across, shallow waters to feed in, open spaces to take off from, currents of wind to travel on, and an ecosystem complex enough to support one of the strangest life forms ever to touch the sky. As night begins to arrive, the ancient sky deepens. The sounds of daytime retreat, giving way to other sounds in the forest and along the water's edge. The river still flows in the darkness, as though telling a story longer than any single life. On the mudflat, the footprints of many creatures overlap one another. Some will be erased by water tomorrow. Some may be covered by sediment. Some will exist for only a few hours and then disappear. Quetzalcoatlus, if it is still standing somewhere in the open, is only a large dark shape within a greater darkness, silent as a part of the land itself. And in that silence, we can feel the most important truth. Before Big Bend became desert, before red rock and dry sunlight took hold of the human imagination, this place was once a world of water, mud, trees, wind, and moving life, a world not created for us to admire, yet still strangely beautiful when we return to it through imagination and through the fragments of evidence left behind. There, Quetzalcoatlus is not alone against the sky. It is a child of that landscape, a shadow born from ancient rivers, a part of a Big Bend greener, wetter, and far older than the desert we know today. Tens of millions of years after Quetzalcoatlus once glided above ancient waters, that sky was no longer there. The damp forests had vanished. The mudflats that once held the footprints of living creatures had been buried, compressed, lifted, eroded, and then exposed as layers of stone beneath the dry sunlight of western Texas. The old river no longer flowed along its ancient course. The sounds of insects, of water, of membranous wings passing through the wind had all retreated into silence. What remained was not an intact body waiting for human beings to find it, but a few thin, hollow, fragile bones, quietly caught in stone like the final sentences of a book from which time had torn away almost every page. In 1971, amid the vast landscape of Big Bend National Park, a young geology student named Douglas A. Lawson discovered a fossil fragment exposed on the surface of the ground. It was not a complete skeleton lying intact, as dinosaur lovers might imagine. It did not appear as a fully formed animal. It was only a piece of bone, long, thin, hollow, made so delicate by time that its very lightness became an unusual sign. In a land known for rock, sun, and ancient layers of sediment, that bone at first might have seemed like a small part of the landscape. But to an eye trained to recognize details that did not belong to ordinary stone, it opened a secret far greater than itself. Imagine that moment slowly. There is no longer the vapor of the Cretaceous, no green, damp mudflats, only the harsh light of modern Texas, dry earth, exposed rock, wind moving through eroded channels and low shrubs. A human being bends down before an object that, millions of years earlier, had once been part of a wing. Perhaps, at that moment, no one could immediately see the whole gigantic creature behind that fragment of bone. No one could hear the wind passing over a wing membrane, or see a broad shadow drifting over ancient water, but in its hollow, thin structure, there was a quiet suggestion. This was not the bone of an ordinary animal of the ground. This was the trace of a creature that had once needed to be light enough to fly. When the bone fragment was recognized as belonging to a pterosaur, the story began to change. Pterosaurs had already been strange creatures in the scientific imagination. But the size of this fossil made everything different. It did not suggest a small, flying reptile, not a creature that merely spread its wings across modest stretches of sky. What scientists began to imagine was a giant pterosaur, so large that it challenged the familiar human sense of the limits of flight. From a piece of bone lying in stone, a shadow began to return to the sky of modern imagination, not through legend, but through measurement, comparison, and the caution of science. Lawson later named this creature Quetzalcoatlus, inspired by Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god of Mesoamerican culture. The name carries a strange beauty. It has the resonance of mythology, while placing upon a real creature an echo of wings, serpents, feathers, and sky. The most famous species name, Quetzalcoatlus northropi, also evokes Jack Northrop, associated with flying wing aircraft designs, and so, within its very name, there is a peculiar meeting, ancient mythology, modern aviation, and the fossil of a creature that flew before human beings had ever dreamed of airplanes. But naming it did not mean the mystery had been solved. In fact, for many decades afterward, Quetzalcoatlus was like a famous figure still standing behind a veil of mist. The public came to know it as one of the largest flying creatures that had ever existed. Illustrations began to show it with enormous wings. Books and articles described it with astonishing numbers. Documentaries and museum exhibitions turned it into an icon of the prehistoric sky. But behind that fame, scientists still had to face a difficult reality. The fossils were incomplete. The bones were fragile, and many fundamental questions still could not be answered with certainty. An incomplete skeleton is like a story missing many passages. We may have a wing fragment, part of a neck, a few details of the body, but lack the connecting pieces needed to understand the full shape and movement. With Quetzalcoatlus, that problem became even more serious because its size was so extraordinary. A small error in one estimate could change the image of the entire creature. How tall was it when standing? What exactly was its wingspan? How heavy was its body? How did it move on the ground? How did it hunt? Was it truly a strong flyer or mainly a glider? None of these questions could be answered by imagination alone. They demanded bones, strata, anatomical comparison, mechanical models, and a great deal of patience. Perhaps that is why Quetzalcoatlus lived two different lives across half a century. One life in popular culture, where it quickly became an icon of gigantism, almost a scientific dragon flying across pages and screens, and another life in the research room, slower, more cautious, where every bone fragment had to be examined again, every hypothesis tested, every image questioned. In the first life, it often appeared clearly, powerfully, enormously, full of symbolic force. In the second, it remained a difficult puzzle, sometimes faint, sometimes debated, always reminding researchers that ancient truth rarely offers itself whole. Imagine a paleontologist standing before those bone fragments. Unlike the storyteller, they are not allowed to fill every gap with beautiful scenes too easily. A long section of bone may speak of a wing, but it cannot tell the whole story of flight by itself. A portion of neck may suggest posture, but it cannot reveal skin color, calls, or daily habits. A layer of rock may speak of an environment, but it cannot fully recreate every morning, every season of water, every encounter between living creatures. The work of science is to walk between two extremes, not ignoring the wonder, but not allowing wonder to pull it beyond the evidence. That gives the journey of understanding Quetzalcoatlus a beauty of its own. It is not the beauty of a quick answer. It is the beauty of slowness. A creature that once crossed the ancient sky must be rebuilt from what remains after tens of millions of years of geology. Stone must be read like memory. Bone must be understood as structure. Empty spaces must remain empty until new evidence appears. There are things we can say with reasonable confidence. It was a pterosaur. It was very large. It lived in the region now known as Big Bend, and it had a body adapted for flight. But there are things that must be spoken more softly. It may have fed in shallow waters. It likely moved on all fours on the ground. It may have taken off with a powerful leap before opening its wings. Words such as perhaps, likely, and according to current models are signs of honesty, not weakness. For many years, debates surrounding Quetzalcoatlus were not only about size, but also about lifestyle. At one point, people imagined it as a giant scavenger, flying far across the ancient landscape in search of animal carcasses. Some hypotheses saw it as a fish hunter, like certain seabirds. Later reconstructions placed it closer to the image of a gigantic heron, walking through shallow waters and catching small prey. Each image does not only change the way we see one creature, it changes the entire film in our minds. Did Quetzalcoatlus glide above the land like a vulture, or stand beside the water as a patient hunter? Did it live alone across open spaces, or often appear near lakes and rivers? Was it the dark shadow of the sky, or a quiet resident of the mudflats? What is fascinating is that science does not erase imagination, but helps imagination stand in the right place. As new evidence is analyzed, some older images become less convincing, while others grow clearer. In 2021, a major body of research on Quetzalcoatlus and related fossils helped bring together many aspects that had long been scattered: excavation history, anatomy, classification, habitat, and the way its body functioned. After many decades, this creature was no longer only a gigantic symbol with vague wings. It began to be seen more closely as a living body with a specific environment, reasonable behavior, limits, and adaptations far more subtle than the simple image of a flying monster. But even when science moves forward, mystery does not disappear completely. It only changes shape. At first, the mystery was, what kind of creature had bones so large and hollow? Then the mystery became, how did it fly? Then, how did it live? What did it eat? How did it interact with the landscape? Did it have smaller relatives in the same region? Each answer opens more questions, as though Quetzalcoatlus is not a single doorway, but a long corridor leading deep into the world of the late Cretaceous. This is perfectly suited to the nature of paleontology. We never truly meet the past. We only draw closer to it through the traces that time happens to leave behind. There is a strange tenderness in thinking about those bones. When Quetzalcoatlus was alive, its light, hollow skeleton was what allowed it to fly. That very lightness helped it leave the ground. glide above rivers, stand in the wind, and move through landscapes that heavier creatures could not see from above. But after death, that lightness made it difficult to preserve. A body made for the sky does not easily become a fossil beneath the earth. Thin parts can break, be crushed, be washed away, or be lost during burial. And so, every surviving fragment feels like a stroke of fortune. It is a very small part of a large creature, but enough to draw the entire ancient sky back into the human mind. And perhaps that is the most beautiful part of this journey, from one piece of bone lying among dry rocks. Human beings began to reconstruct a creature that once passed through the warm air of a greener world. Not by invention, but by listening. Listening to the shape of bone. Listening to the environment of the rock layer. Listening to the limits of physics. Listening even to what remains unknown. Instead of rushing to fill it, a scientist looking at a fossil is not only searching for answers, but also learning how to ask better questions. And Quetzalcoatlus, in its silence, has forced human beings to ask very large ones. It forces us to ask about the limits of flight, about how a giant body can be light, about ecosystems that have vanished, about the sky before human beings existed, about how a creature can be famous in popular imagination, yet still remain full of mystery in science. And deeper still, it forces us to ask how we understand the past itself. We often want the past to appear complete, like a film, but fossils never give us the entire film. They give us only a few separate frames, a few traces, a few outlines. The rest must be reconstructed carefully. Not so coldly that life disappears, but not so freely that truth is left behind. When evening falls over modern Big Bend, the cliffs and eroded channels may turn dark yellow, then reddish-brown, then violet-gray in the sunset. Wind passes through the dry land, touching layers of sediment that were once mud, once river, once ground crossed by ancient creatures. If you stood there, it might be difficult to imagine that this place was once wetter, greener, filled with shallow waters and enormous wings. But that very difficulty makes the work of fossils feel miraculous. They are not only objects in stone, they are points of connection between two worlds that no longer resemble each other. A big bend of dry sunlight today, and a big bend of rivers from tens of millions of years ago. Perhaps in a museum storage room, a Quetzalcoatlus bone fragment lies still beneath gentle light. There is no more wind, no more mud, no more river. It has been numbered, preserved, studied, compared, and sometimes brought out to tell the public about a creature almost impossible to believe. Yet even lying still, it carries movement within it, a movement that ended very long ago, but has not completely vanished from our imagination. Each time a scientist looks at it again, each time a new model is proposed, each time someone hears its story in the night, those wings open a little farther in the mind. And that is how Quetzalcoatlus returns, not through flesh, skin, breath, or the true sound of wings. It returns through bones in stone, through human curiosity, through questions stretched across half a century. From its first discovery in 1971 to the major studies gathered many decades later. This creature has traveled a strange path, from the ancient sky down into mud, from mud into stone, from stone into human hands, from the research room back into the sky of imagination. And along that path, it has kept what makes it most compelling, the feeling that there are truths on Earth so vast that even after evidence appears, we still have to look up for a long time before we can believe they once existed. As night descends over this story, the bones and stone no longer feel dry or lifeless. They are like small lamps shining into a very deep darkness of time. They do not give us everything, but they give us enough to begin, enough to see a tall creature standing beside the water, enough to see wings opening in the air, enough to see Big Bend before it was desert, enough to understand that science is sometimes not the act of taking magic away, but the only way to keep that magic from becoming falsehood. And somewhere between stone, wind, and memory, the mystery of Quetzalcoatlus continues. It is no longer the completely obscure mystery it was when a bone first appeared beneath the Texas sun, but it has never been fully closed either. It still stands there, in the meeting place between what is known and what is unknown, between fossil and imagination, between truth and awe. A creature once flew through the world before human beings, then vanished, then returned to us through bones more fragile than we might expect. A mystery that has lasted half a century, and perhaps longer still, because each time science looks deeper into the past, the ancient sky opens another space of silence. There are afternoons in Earth's history when no living creature knows it is living near the end of an age. The sun still sets as it always has. Water still flows across familiar mudflats. Insects still murmur among the low vegetation. Small creatures still hide beneath roots, beneath stones, beneath damp soil, and high above, if we look up into the sky of the late Cretaceous, we can still imagine a vast shadow drifting silently past, its membranous wings opening in the evening light, its long neck turned toward ancient rivers. Quetzalcoatlus still belongs to that sky, as though that sky will go on forever. But no age goes on forever. Around 66 million years ago, the world of non-avian dinosaurs, of pterosaurs, of many ancient marine creatures, and of countless other forms of life entered an event so immense that it divided the history of life into two halves. Before, it was a planet still bearing the shape of the Cretaceous, with ecosystems that had developed across millions of years. After, it was another Earth, suddenly poorer, emptier, more deeply wounded, yet quietly opening the way for new lines of life. We often think of that event through the image of a giant asteroid, a violent impact, a burning sky. But with the story of Quetzalcoatlus, perhaps we should move more slowly, not to make it less serious, but to feel the frightening silence of a world gradually losing the things that once seemed completely ordinary. Before that catastrophe occurred, the sky was not empty. Pterosaurs had lived on Earth for a very long time, far longer than the entire history of human beings. They had taken many forms, many sizes, many ways of life. Some were smaller. Some lived near the sea. Some glided over open landscapes. Some fed beside water. And then there were giants like Quetzalcoatlus, among the final creatures that gave the Mesozoic sky a grandeur almost impossible to imagine. When we see a modern bird flying past a window, we are seeing a story of survival, But when we think of Quetzalcoatlus, we are thinking of a story that is closed completely. A flying lineage that left no living descendants in the world today. Let us return to ancient Big Bend on an afternoon near the end of that age. No one in this world knows the future. There is no sign, in any human language, that a great boundary is drawing near. The river still reflects golden light. The mudflats still hold the footprints of creatures passing back and forth. The forest still has its dark spaces, where large bodies move slowly among leaves and trunks. Quetzalcoatlus may be standing beside a stretch of shallow water, as it has stood many times before. It may lower its long beak toward the mud, waiting for a small movement. It may step onto drier ground, lift its head toward the wind, and choose a place wide enough to leave the earth. To it, that day may simply be another day in the life of an ancient creature. It is precisely that ordinariness that makes the story sadder. Great ages often do not recognize themselves as great ages while they are unfolding. A forest does not know it is part of the final chapter of an era. A river does not know that the layers of mud it leaves behind will become the memory of a vanished world. A giant flying creature does not know that its wings belong to one of the last chapters of the pterosaurs. From the point of view of the past, everything continues. From our point of view, each of those scenes carries within it the light of farewell. When the impact event happened, it was not only a moment in the sky. It set off consequences that spread through the atmosphere. Oceans, land, sunlight, temperature, and food chains, dust, gases, and material thrown high into the air may have blocked sunlight for a time. Forests were devastated in many places. Temperature, food sources, vegetation, and ecosystems were severely disrupted for large creatures, for creatures that needed a great deal of energy, for creatures dependent on stable environments and complex food webs. The world after the event became harsh in ways that old bodies and instincts may not have been able to answer quickly enough. We should not imagine a specific Quetzalcoatlus watching an asteroid fall and then immediately vanishing in a cinematic scene. There is no evidence for such an individual, and this story does not need an invented death in order to be moving. What matters more is the disappearance of an entire possibility of life. Shallow waters may have changed. The small creatures it once fed upon may have declined. Landing places, floodplains, forests, and familiar air currents over a stable landscape may no longer have been the same. The sky was still there, but the world beneath the sky had changed. And a flying creature, no matter how wide its wings, cannot live on the sky alone. Perhaps after the catastrophe, the first days were days of confusion for every surviving creature. The light may have been weaker, the air may have felt heavier, the landscape may have been covered with ash, dust, dead trees, the smell of burning, and the strange silence of places that had once been full of living sound. The creatures that remained had to search for food in a world that had lost many familiar rhythms. For small species, there may have been hiding places, more flexible food sources, bodies that required less energy to endure the dark interval. But for giant flying animals like Quetzalcoatlus and its relatives, the greatness that had once been an advantage could become a burden. A magnificent body needs a world rich enough to support it. This is one of nature's deepest paradoxes. The very traits that make a creature wondrous in the peaceful days of an ecosystem can make it more fragile when the world collapses. Wide wings helped Quetzalcoatlus travel far. But traveling far did not mean finding food if the living systems below had broken apart. Height helped it observe. But observation could not save it if the ground no longer held the familiar shallow waters. A light body helped it fly. But lightness did not mean it could live without energy. Every biological design is in agreement with the environment. When the environment changes too quickly, that agreement can be broken. And then, over time, the sky lost its gigantic membranous wings. Not in a single sound, not like a door slamming shut in front of an observer, but like a lamp slowly fading in a vast room. Perhaps some individuals survived for a while. Perhaps some regions held on to life longer than others. But in the end, the pterosaur lineage did not cross that great boundary into the world that followed. When the dust settled, when vegetation slowly returned, when the surviving groups of animals began to expand into newly opened spaces, the sky no longer held Quetzalcoatlus. No more long necks rising like tree shadows beside the water. No more broad membranes opening over ancient rivers. No more pterosaurs. But the sky did not remain empty forever. This is where the story becomes not only one of loss, but also of transition. Birds, the descendants of a feathered branch of dinosaurs, survived that event, not all of them, but enough to continue. In the world after the Great Extinction, birds gradually moved into many new ecological spaces, across immense stretches of time. They would diversify, spread across continents, out to sea, into forests, up into mountains, down across grasslands, becoming the familiar inhabitants of the modern sky. Every morning today, when a small bird lands on a power line or flies past a roof, we are seeing a form of life that crossed a boundary. Quetzalcoatlus could not. Even so, that continuity does not fully replace what was lost. Birds are not pterosaurs. Feathered wings are not membranous wings supported by an extraordinarily elongated finger. An eagle, a vulture, a gull may astonish us, but no creature today carries the standing posture of Quetzalcoatlus beside the water. No creature makes us look up at the sky and see the outline of a giant flying reptile, tall like a land animal, and yet able to open its wings into the air. The sky is still alive, but one kind of life has vanished from it forever. Perhaps that is why, when we think of Quetzalcoatlus, we feel both wonder and regret. It was not the only species to disappear, nor the only strange creature in Earth's history, but it represents something very large, an evolutionary chapter that once succeeded, once endured, once reached forms that seemed almost impossible, and then finally closed. Some lineages disappear because they become poorly adapted over long periods of time, but others disappear because the world changes too forcefully, too quickly, too widely, leaving even designs that were once brilliant with nowhere to continue. Imagine a sky after the catastrophe. Many years or many generations later, there is no longer a great shadow drifting over the floodplains of ancient Big Bend. The wind still blows, but it no longer passes across the wing membranes of Quetzalcoatlus. Water still finds its way through the land, but the tall hunters at the water's edge are gone. smaller creatures may return first. Plants may slowly grow again. Birds may appear more often over time. But the absence of pterosaurs is a silence that no other species fills in the same shape. It is like a song that has ended. And though other songs will rise afterward, that melody does not return. And yet, in stone, a very small part of that sky remains: hollow bone fragments, traces in sediment, geological layers recording ancient environments. All of them are like embers still holding the heat of a fire that went out long ago when human beings find them. We do not merely find evidence of a species. We find evidence that the sky once had a history far deeper than our own memory. Before cities, before civilizations, before myths of dragons and giant birds, Earth truly had flying creatures so large that later myths seem almost like faint echoes of nature's own possibility. In the final chapter of this story, Quetzalcoatlus is no longer only the mystery of a takeoff, nor only the hunter of shallow waters, nor only a skeleton in stone. It becomes a symbol of finitude. A creature may be very large. A lineage may be very ancient. A world may remain stable for millions of years, but nothing is guaranteed forever. Earth is not a stage built to remain unchanged for any species. It changes, sometimes so slowly that it seems nearly motionless, sometimes so violently that even the sky must change its rulers. And perhaps that is what makes this story so fitting for a quiet night. It does not only tell of a giant creature, it reminds us to feel time as something wider than a human life, wider than history written into books, wider than anything we are used to calling long-lasting. A shadow once drifted over water 70 million years ago. A pair of wings once opened in the wind. A body once lived an ordinary life in an extraordinary world. Then all of it disappeared. Not because it was not miraculous, but because even miracles can belong to a particular moment in the history of life. Let the final scene appear slowly. Sunset falls over ancient Big Bend. The river changes color beneath the low light. The mudflats hold the last warmth of the day. The forest stands still, as though listening to something very far away. High above, Quetzalcoatlus glides past, unaware that it is one of the last silhouettes of a great lineage. Its wings tilt in the wind. Its shadow moves across the water, across the tree trunks, across a world soon to become something else. There is no music, no declaration, no sign meant for it, only the sky, the river, and the silent motion of a creature living fully within its own day. Then that shadow recedes. It moves toward the ancient horizon, where the light is thinning and the evening wind is rising from the warm ground. After a while, the wings are only a very small, dark line within the color of the sky. Then that dark line dissolves into the vastness. The sky is still there, but in our imagination, it has just lost something that can never be called back. The giant flyers had their time. They once opened their wings on a planet without human beings. They once made the sky heavier, wider, stranger, and when they vanished, Earth did not stop, but a very ancient beauty closed with them. Many millions of years later, human beings would stand beneath the modern sky and dream of flight. We would build airplanes, name the stars, redraw ancient creatures from fossils, and marvel at one name, Quetzalcoatlus. But before all of that, There was once a sky that did not need us to witness it in order to be magnificent. A sky of pterosaurs, of ancient wind, of gigantic membranous wings. And in that final sky, Quetzalcoatlus still flies, silent and distant, like a vast dream Earth once dreamed before letting it dissolve into stone, into time, and into the deep silence of the past. And now, as the ancient sky slowly darkens in our imagination, our journey beside Quetzalcoatlus also gently comes to an end. We have stood beside the shallow waters of a world tens of millions of years away from us. We have seen a creature that seemed almost impossible to exist, towering, strangely light, stepping through the mud on all fours, lowering its long beak toward the water, and then, at some moment, launching itself from the ground so its enormous wings could catch the first current of air. It did not need a roar. It did not need loud chases. The mere shadow of it drifting over rivers, over forests, through the evening light of the Cretaceous, was enough to make the entire sky feel different. Quetzalcoatlus is gone now. The membranous wings of the pterosaurs vanished with a great age, but within the thin bones buried deep in stone, within the traces that scientists patiently read again and again, it still leaves behind a quiet question. How extraordinary were the things Earth once created, before human beings were here to witness them? If you have stayed with this story until these final minutes, thank you very much. If you enjoy journeys through history, mythology, ancient creatures, and slow stories told before sleep, please follow the fan page or subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next journeys. And before we leave this ancient sky tonight, leave a comment next time. What creature, what civilization, or what mystery of Earth would you like to hear about? I will see you again on another quiet night.